Now is started.
Okay,
Sorry.
perfect. In my presentation, I have 3 parts of my presentation. I will give a short introduction of TNO. I will give an introduction on what's the Dutch Gaia-X Hub. And I think what might be also a very interesting part is about an operational data space. What did we do? And how was it organized? Because what I also learned, I'm very active also on the European data space area. I think this is one of the first operational data spaces across Europe. And it's good to see what's the business model, what are the incentives for setting up such a data space, and what are the first lessons learned. I fully realize that even half an hour is quite short for all the things we are doing, but I also, at the end, I will give some references, and if you want, drop me an email. I can send more references afterwards as well to all kind of exciting materials. Then I will start sharing my screen, and hopefully technology will work. Share, and having this.
Yeah, we can see your screen. Thank you, Herman.
From the beginning. And then let's see if this is going to work. As TNO, we started to facilitate both the Gaia-X as well as previously for the IDSA. And IDSA is also a European international organization, international data space organization, which is basically, say, the top part of the Gaia-X initiative. TNO, for those, because many of you are in Switzerland and mostly say for more German-oriented people, the quickest introduction, we are kind of the small Fraunhofer Institute in the Netherlands, for those who know Fraunhofer. TNO is a Dutch research and development institute founded by the Dutch law, so we don't have owners. We are a non-profit organization. Our CEO, of course, prefers black figures over red figures and has to report to the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Basically, what's important is bringing innovation in the Netherlands and stimulating the Dutch economy. But of course, the Dutch economy is very correlated to across Europe and also worldwide. So we are also more and more working on a worldwide scale. We are divided in 9 units. They are depicted over here. And I'm from the ICT unit. Overall, we have about 3,000 people. And the ICT unit, we have about 350 people. And of course, ICT is more and more also the engine where we collaborate with all the other units, because digitization is happening everywhere. I'm responsible for the data sharing portfolio, and what's important and the role of TNO is, as you might know, for data sharing, there are many challenges ahead. Say, do we want to share data? What's the business model around it? GDPR, confidentiality of data. And even if you share data, can you understand each other? Because mostly there are different languages or different interpretation. Say, for instance, green economy, but everybody has his own interpretation of what's green. And also the business models across data sharing are quite in development, let's put it that way. And the role of TNO is stimulating those ecosystems, bringing different parties together, doing proof of concept pilots. We don't want to have, say, operational experience, because there are commercial parties. That's not our role. But we want to hand over to commercial parties if we build up an ecosystem. And I will show an example later on in the manufacturing industry. And what we already see ahead, because many of those initiatives now start from one sector. The pitfall is, of course, that they build another silo and can't have interoperability with the other sectors. It's both, say, interoperability across sectors as well transnational interoperability. And we are also, for instance, quite excited that we have a collaboration with NTT, that's a Japanese telecom operator, acting across the world, and which approach those, say, can we have an interoperability between the data space we built in the Netherlands and the data space in Japan? Because I think transnational interoperability is, of course, important as well. Say, for instance, logistics across the Rhine, we love to collaborate with the Swiss partners as well, because in the end, if ships arrive at the Dutch harbor in Rotterdam, it will be transported further, say in Germany, Switzerland, etc. And you want to have an end-to-end chain and an interoperable chain. And what's very important for, say, that we build our portfolio, the key design principle is sovereignty, keeping control of your own data. I don't want to compete, say, with the big American companies, because their proposition is, give the data to me, you can trust us, we care for you. For some parties, that might be acceptable, but for many other parties, they want to stay in control and have of their own data. So data sovereignty is one of our key design principles, which we want to support. In the end, data sharing is all about trust, if you're assuring a level of trust. But data sharing in the end is only a means for delivering value, because you can share data, but what do you want to do with it? In the end, it's about creating value, both for society as well for economic purposes. And there we have several topics, which I shortly read, is building data spaces. I will give a good example later on. In the end, hybrid data, combining, say, machine learning with expert knowledge. How can you learn? And a good example is, for instance, car drivers. Car drivers can be supported by machine learning to have more flexibility, but in the end, you also want to include the expertise of the car driver himself as well. Another area which is very important is about sensitive data. Sometimes you can have more insights of sensitive data without sharing the data. There are technologies like multi-party computation, federated learning, synthetic data. So you don't show the data itself, but you can recognize patterns. If you have a technical background, you can make a graph without showing the points behind the graph. But for many decisions, it's simply so. It's, for instance, say it's for 60% effective or for 80% effective. That's what you want to know for a business decision without knowing exactly the underlying data. So that's also a growing, and we already apply this, for instance, in the healthcare sector, where, for instance, the effectiveness for medicines, you want to know it's effective for this target group without knowing the individuals. So in this area, we already built proof of concept that this works, and also confirm the legal framework. Another area is digital twin, making a copy of your physical infrastructure, and how do you keep that up to date? An important form, because we are governmental related, is trust in AI. That's very important to say, what are the ethical constraints, legal constraints in using AI, explainability, reliability, and in the end, self-sovereign identity is about bringing credentials in the digital domain. Just as an introduction of TNO, now I focus on the topic of Gaia-X. As you know, say there is a huge ambitions from the European Commission. I know you are not a part of the EU, but strongly following the EU and basically surrounded by the EU and Switzerland, is stimulating the data economy, because we see those big American companies who already have a kind of track record of dealing with data, and many people have an opinion in which way they do dealing with the data. It's also say to have an European equivalent, and there they're really aiming at building common data spaces to have a trusted way and based on the principle of data sovereignty. That's one of the key principles, and I think in that area we are already front running compared, say, to the American and also the Chinese approach, because they have their own view of the world. For Europe, the European values, we care for them, and I think for data, based on data sovereignty, and I think we also showed with GDPR, everybody, it's now also copycatting in different other parts of the world. So for data sovereignty, we are running ahead, and we also have a differentiator and can build an own economy in that area as well. This is simply saying the kind of, say, market expectations. Of course, you have the data access like broadband, mobile access for the data. I think there we have a kind of own economy, I think, and that's also the situation that's, I think, a good acceptable situation in covering with the European values. You have the data services. Now, we are starting in that area, but of course, still the Americans have a huge size of the market. And for the cloud and data platforms, yeah, that's there's hardly any European industry also on small scale. So in some areas, we are doing quite well. In other areas, let's put it politely, there are some concerns. And what are the kind of concerns? Just a few examples. Some are Dutch, some are more European. Is, for instance, say the majority of the Dutch secondary schools are using Google-related applications. What's exactly done with the data in that area? Are they, say, learning from our children, or what are they doing with that? So the control of the Americans about, say, the educational system. The control about the cars. Like Tesla Tesla car is generating a huge amount of data, all flooding to America. What are they doing with that kind of data? What you also see, the cloud providers, this is an overview, is that in the cloud area, the US players are really dominant. Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and I think they are almost 80–90% of the market share. And I can imagine that in Switzerland, that's not that much difference. Also, say the local governmental core, at least in the Netherlands, it's now also indirectly outsourced to Equinix, which is a US-based company. So where is the data and the core data, and what's the control and the reach of the American government towards such areas? Of course, if there are any problems with the US House, what are the consequences in the Netherlands and also in Switzerland? And the good news is, at least say, there is more and more awareness about, and also say due to Corona, I think, and also due to some incidents, that say we need some more independence, sovereignty in those areas. So what are the challenges? One is the European data spaces. So having interoperability of data across Europe in a data sovereign way, trusted data sharing, and other areas also. If you are attached to a certain provider, is it easily to move from, say, one cloud to another cloud? So portability of the applications. Or is it simply, say, a complete login, and if you enter that area, you never can come back anymore? What I already mentioned, data sovereignty is a real issue, and I learned, say, that in Switzerland it might be even more an issue, because Swiss love Swiss, as far as I learned. And it's also, say, about cloud migration. Can you move from one cloud to another cloud if you have another cloud? So the flexibility and also the feeling that you stay in control and are not locked up with some vendor. And what can you do, say, if you need to outsource some of the computing capabilities to some other computing jobs? Overall, what I think, what's at least a generic opinion in the Netherlands as well, the value is in the data. So in the end, it's really can you stay in control of the data? In the end, the value is not that much in the hardware. So in the end, the key question is, can you control of the data? And sometimes it's necessary that you can assure that the data is in Switzerland, in your case, or in Europe. Basically, say, if the hardware attached to that is from, say, a non-Swiss company or a non-Dutch company, I think we also have to be realistic in this area, say, for cloud solutions, etc. I think the Americans are 5 years ahead of what, say, current European offerings are bringing. But it's really, say, what's the framework, and can you show and prove? And that's also what we more and more do, is like engineering. Can we have a technical proof that the providers are attached and conform to the European law, or in your case, to the Swiss law, and show, for instance, also say a full stack integrity. Can you show that the data is not copied or whatever, so that you really can stay, so having a kind of measurements approval, and in the end, whatever will happen, say with Gaia-X, I'm definitely sure that also the Americans won't lose that European market. Maybe in some niches there will be players, but in the end, say for some cloud related, we still have, say, also influence of the cloud providers. Just making some statements as well. Then the purpose of Gaia-X in the end is, say, from letting control to getting in control. I think that's one of the important message, and that's also, say, the design people. All people who deliver data, they want to stay in control of their data. So it's open, transparent, distributed, data sovereignty. That are the key principles of Gaia-X. While, say, current American approach, still, if you have to sign, it's a kind of black box approach. The data is going to the States or to the Chinese, if you're in the area, and basically you don't know exactly what's going to happen with that data. And that's also shifting the expectations. That's another one, is one of staying in control is that you have flexibility in interoperability and portability. I have a long history in telecommunications starting in the 90s. I think one of the key principles is, say, that mobile operators and fixed operators, you have the chance to move from one provider to another provider. So if you are not satisfied, so there is not a complete lock-in. And I always say with telecom providers, they have on the back end, they have a kind of collaboration, mostly enforced by law, but still, but they have, say, retail competition and a wholesale collaboration and a backbone collaboration, giving a kind of nice model where users have freedom of choice. And that's also one of the purposes, say, in Gaia-X, to create more freedom of choice for other parties. So, and that's one of the key principles in that area is interoperability and portability of your solutions, and not simply, say, a kind of one way to the provider and you're completely locked up in one domain. So this is a kind of overview sheet of Gaia-X. So federated, so bringing different providers together, a federated data infrastructure to stimulate innovation across Europe and be prepared for the future, European collaboration, transparency, so you know what's happening, creating those digital ecosystems in that area, having, say, control, but also maximum security and protection of the customer rights. And they are going to facilitate different data spaces in the various sectors, and I will come to an example later on. And what's the role of such a Gaia-X is, say, specifying, say, making the specifications of the collaboration. So what's the technical architecture? And on the top end, say, of the Gaia-X, so the data spaces, there is already a lot of work done in the International Data Spaces Association, and a lot of, say, cookbooks, white books, and are already available, both, say, on the technical level as well as on the governance level, and also the collaboration where, of course, it's not only about creating paperware, but it's also making software available, showing that, say, interoperability is not drawing a line from one ecosystem to the other ecosystem, because mostly if you build such a system, it's far more complex. So you also have, say, to build real working solutions and giving good examples. And of course, what's also quite important in the end, the qualification instruments, and also showing that you fulfill the promises. And that's also part of the promises. And what's then the role of a Gaia-X hub is connecting all the different people within a country. And those Gaia-X hubs are, say, connected on the European scale. So they share experience on European level and organizing the system on, in my case, on the Dutch level, but that can also be on the Swiss level. Spread all, say, both upstream and downstream, what I said. So downstream is what's going on in Europe, spreading all the information to the interested parties within the Netherlands. But on the other hand, say the upstream, if there are specific requirements from Dutch sectors, that those aspects are involved in the bodies on the EU level and coordinating in that way, say, both the regulation, standardization, etc. And it's also, say, a kind of points of presence for expertise and consolidation, because in the end, interoperability, of course, is a key requirement, and bringing all those pieces together and streamline all the different initiatives. Just quite high level. I now we're diving in, say, in the next slide, say, to an example. Say, of course, say, data sharing is not something, say, what started just 1 or 2 years ago. At least 10 or 15 years, there are already many existing ecosystems. We made a picture last year of the Dutch. There were more than 70 initiatives of parties, communities, etc., who brought together, who already did a level of data sharing in some way, mostly more proprietary. And that analysis is publicly available. I can share the link afterwards. And some are more, say, sector specific, and more are more sector agnostics initiatives. And just to give one example, that's smart connected supplier networks. That's an ecosystem which started in the south of the Netherlands and bringing the manufacturing industry. And that's fully compliant with the current state of art of, say, what's done in the international data spaces, as well as, say, the pre-standard of Gaia-X. And I think it's interesting as the third part of my presentation to highlight what's, say, practically done, what are the incentives for a specific sector to move in this direction. It's called Smart Connected Supplier Networks. And it's a running data space at this stage. So already more than 300 companies are connected to this data space. So what's the background in data sharing in the industry? So why are we sharing data? So what's the rationale? What is the kind of solution? And why should parties join such a smart supplier networks? In the end, what you see in the manufacturing industry is that in the past, factories were quite standalone, but more and more there is a need for connecting factories. For instance, for remote maintenance, you have a part of the machine which is delivered by a third party, and they want to have remote maintenance. But then they are a kind of intruder in your factory. But still, you want to do it in a secure and safe way and controlled, that only, say, that manufacturing has access to that machine. So there is a need for data sharing, but really in a secure, safe environment. And what's also quite crucial in this area, this is the high-tech industry in the Netherlands, is that, say, the information is not shared by, say, the Americans or Chinese, because it's also kind of competitive knowledge to bring all those pieces together. So they really have a need to have a secure environment to share data of their suppliers. And that's also why do they do that together? Because they realize in the Dutch industry, to stay competitive in some way. Of course, we know we are in some level competitors of each other, but to stay competitive on a worldwide scale, we need a kind of data sharing ecosystem to work together as smoothly as possible to stay competitive and ahead. Just as an example, and this is initiated, I don't know, say ASML is one of the biggest companies in the Netherlands. I think it's just reached the top 30 of environment. What's they doing? They are building, say, the chip making machines. And they have 90% market share worldwide. So it's really crucial. And there's, for instance, there is now a discussion if we might export it to China, because it's also kind of critical knowledge. But ASML, so it's high-end industry, but they have a supplier network, sometimes with 10 layers deep. So it's the high-end industry. And so it's just say from this way to the steel producer, which is simply making the metal very specific. There are many parties in between, and they want to collaborate as smoothly as possible without sharing competitive knowledge. For instance, say ASML want to know what's the delivery time of your products, but those parties don't want to share which other parties they are dealing. So they don't want to mention, say, my supplier is X, Y, or Z, because then they might become obsolete. But in the end, you need to have these kind of information across the whole chain, because the delivery time might depend on this one, or this one. So some information can be shared, but should be anonymized, or should be also, say, controlled access. And in the end, say for many of in the past, you had those EDI connections, but that were very expensive connections, which only the larger companies could support. Say you talking about 100,000 euros a year. Now for a small medium enterprise, that's simply too much. So what they want is, say, you connect only once and you can communicate to all the different suppliers in one way. And that's, say, avoiding all kind of manual copying, avoiding administrative burden, avoiding all kind of errors, and optimizing the supply chain. And it started, say, with the simple things like orders, the delivery time, the quotations, the invoices, but it's moving forward to measurement data, and for instance, also for remote maintenance, etc. What's the business model for this? So we founded a foundation that's called the Smart Connected Supplier Networks. That's a non-for-profit foundation, which do the basic functionalities. On top of that, you have commercial service providers. So they are earning money and they are delivering services to their end users. For instance, here is a sub-manufacturing who they say, and they say, I'm offering that you can have a secure sub-interconnect between this one and this one. So they are offering the commercial services and supporting the operational business with all those small and medium enterprises. And the benefits for these companies, you connect once, and you are not only connected, say, with those ones, but you are also connected to the other ones in this ecosystem. And currently, we are building, say, here an interconnect with the entity, so the Japanese data space. So also Japanese parties in the Netherlands can connect to Japanese companies in Japan as well. So we are building out this ecosystem, and we are looking forward to build to other ecosystems as well. And as I mentioned, there are about 10 to 15 service providers at this stage connected who are delivering the commercial services. And we have more than 300 companies who are already attached to this ecosystem. So it's an operational data space. And the foundation is delivering, say, and that's more might be too technical, but for instance, address book, basically it's, say, the functionality, how can you find each other and how can you trust each other? Of course, it's just like, say, the traditional telephone business. You need to kind of, say, know where to find each other. And also identity management is a crucial part. Can you prove who you are before entering the complete systems? So it's an open standard. It's a way of collaborating with each other. It's an industry standard, and it's also, say, we are now also building similar in logistics, and the next wave will also be to have the logistics and the manufacturing industry together. And it's a common language to exchange all kind of manufacturing related data. And it has seamless agreements between the service providers to ensure the promise of connecting once and communicate with everybody. And this is an overview. So these are the commercial service providers delivering the services. And this is an example of all kinds of companies who are connected to smart connected supplier networks. Then my last slide, I think a main takeaways is many things are developing, but there is much, from my opinion, about Gaia-X. A lot of topics are only discussed. I think the first wave, like data spaces, you can make it operational. You can do it this year. So you can also make it practical. And of course, in the Netherlands, we also have many other initiatives, and I can share those links later on, say, to have more background information. And I think then I talked almost for half an hour as planned. So I'm happy to hand back to Switzerland.
Thanks a lot, Herman. That was very interesting and enlightening about your activities. And before we go into a short question and answer section, I hand over to Christian, but I share my slides again, because he will talk for 9 minutes, agreed, about the Swiss perspective on data space and data sovereignty. Christian, go ahead. You just told me, tell me when I have to switch forward with your slides.
You might perhaps put them on presenter mode.
You would like to have your presenter mode yourself, so you can have it.
Necessarily.
Just take it.
Yourself?
Yes.
Okay.
It's open.
So I don't see. Just a second. Sorry, I seem to have an echo. No, now it's good. So hello, Christian, and I'm happy to also say some words, but I do think, Andre, you will need to help me with the slides and take them back. I don't see them as I did before, so maybe it's better for me that you do it. And but so what I want to pick up or give in a Swiss perspective to say some words about how the explanations of Herman resonate with us. And this was of course very interesting for us, and I tell you a bit more why exactly. So what I mean, there was an animation in it, and if you actually can go on the like on the full screen mode with the slides, Andre, that would be great if you can do that. Can you? If not, I just lead you through like that. You see in the left-hand row, you see that icon, and there you have a number of terms or notions we have described, and you have also heard in the presentation of Herman, and in the center of all of it are the data spaces, and that's just to reflect that the Swiss Data Line thinks data spaces really are the response to so many things, including data sovereignty, which you see above, and Herman also highlighted that it's really about control of and over data. So I think data sovereignty is a good term, and it's more the control over data we want to achieve than the control over infrastructure. That's one of the hypotheses we consider and discuss within the Swiss Data Alliance. And then there are the data spaces also have an impact, of course, how data will be used. And also Herman showed the ecosystem of the manufacturers in the Netherlands to very nicely highlight how that can help to increase the benefit of data. And he also said that the standards are important, and that's also the manufacturing case, which shows that standards are very important for data spaces to function and work. And how to to coordinate a number of data spaces, this is a question, and that's why it's interesting for us to align with other organizations abroad, to learn from them how they are hubs to deal with the standard Gaia-X we talk about. And you see, when we speak of data spaces, I have put an image in the right upper corner. Data space rely on an inbound, outbound model. I mean, that's obvious. Data must come from somewhere and will need to be used somewhere else. And this is really an inbound, outbound method. And you see, and we see that architecture or that concept in the Gaia-X. And that's also, I just referred to an architecture slide or a conceptual slide related to Gaia-X. And that's why we are interested in Gaia-X. But we also see an important organizational question. And the organizational question is, how do we coordinate with other countries, foreign data spaces in the Netherlands, for instance, and data spaces in Switzerland? How should that be done? How can we coordinate data spaces within Switzerland so to make them even more useful? What do we need to do? For instance, if we want to move data about certain, I don't know, movements of goods from one data space into another data space, where the movement of goods also is of relevance, then we probably need to have aligned standards. Otherwise, there is no automated way of bridging the gaps or crossing the border between one or the other data space. And I think without coordination, that wouldn't work. And that's why we're interested. And we see the data hubs as a response to achieve that goal. And that's why we're interested in Gaia-X. That's why we're interested in what Herman told us. And if we look at the data hubs of the Gaia-X, data hubs are a very important concept in Gaia-X, because that's really a concept to organize the flow down of the overall broader concept of Gaia-X into a national jurisdiction, into national data spaces. So if we move to the next slide, please, then we see how we think about these hubs. So let's imagine Switzerland would build a Swiss data hub. Then how would we organize that Swiss data hub? So we could give the Swiss Data Hub a number of roles, and we've seen Herman giving or identifying the roles the Dutch Data Hub has given to itself. And if we look at it, then we see that we could also define a number of approaches. We could say we are reactive. I mean, if we say we, I don't refer to any organization in particular. Now I'm really talking on a conceptual level. And a data hub could take a very reactive role only, or it could be a proactive role and could deploy that attitude either on the level of information. So being a connector, being someone saying, being someone helping, someone like a lighthouse, someone to turn to. That's the navigator, I think, as a working title in the Gaia-X concept. So the navigator would be who stands there and helps to exchange information, point to other people, but only upon request. And then there is the more active role of providing information, and that's the communicator, and would take a role of an evangelist or etc. Then you could, of course, take more initiative and ownership, being a connector, someone with a reactive role, or an accelerator initiating prototypes. And I have that grayed out because we, of course, need to also take into account what's already there on a federal level, for instance, the institutional roles that are already there. So there needs to be some alignment on that. So I go to the next slide, just for you to say, to frame, if we define that, then we need to also think of how we think of that. Then please go back a bit. Thank you. To say data sovereignty is really one of the terms connected to the data spaces, or the other way around. Data spaces are connected to the term of data sovereignty, and Herman has talked a lot about it. And the only problem is there are like 40, and we made a research, there are 40 notions that all somewhat tie into that term. And so basically we can say that data sovereignty somehow translates into control. And we need, of course, make sure that it's not a 1984 kind of control. It's not a surveillance or not autocracy kind of control, but it's a control, an exercise of control that is congruent to our values we have in the European market. And I count now Switzerland into that for the moment. So we believe, and also we structured our research and say, well, data sovereignty basically has three components, and one of them is we need to be strong as a society, so to be resilient against negative impacts or influences from above or from within too. So that's strength. Data spaces really help to build strength and resilience from also on a commercial level. For instance, we need to also protect our own range of maneuver. So just the ability to digitize is also part of that. And we need to align on international competencies. These are just in short, three components we have found out. That's probably what we think the term data sovereignty means in essence. So just for you to highlight, there are many components to that term. Please, the next slide, so that I can point you to our current work. We are, and one more, we are defining that term, and we are calling for participants to build with us another working paper to do even more work on that definition, and make sure that within Switzerland we have some sort of consolidated view on how we could possibly think about that term. We don't need to make sure everyone thinks this in the same way, but at least we want to make sure that if we use terminology, we refer to the same concepts. And then everyone is free, of course, to have his or her own opinion. And that's the purpose of the paper we call for. And I would like to click once more to terminate, because then Anya would take over, and I click another time. Anya will, after the Q&A, take over to explain more how that reaching out to the Swiss Data Alliance for participation could work and be organized. Thank you. You are on mute, Andedo.
Thank you. Yes. Guinness error. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Christian, for this contribution. We are a bit behind our schedule, but no problem. I open up quickly for some questions to Herman, and also, of course, to Christian. I have seen one question in the chat at, well, I think to Herman, how do we avoid to build up new data silos within data spaces?
I think that's a very good question, because that's really one of the challenges, say, to build kind of federation of data spaces. How can you connect to each other and avoid that you build another silo? And it's both a level of standardization, having also an open, say, model, say, for finding data and the interoperability, and also more, say, the automation of. And we have quite some concepts already developed also in a project like Federated, is also, say, having a kind of translation between different data sources, and also in what way data of the different domains can be built together. There is also a European initiative, which is where I'm now very active together with the Gaia-X organization, the IDSA, the BDVA, and Fireware, about, say, the data spaces support center, also to align the interoperability between data spaces across different sectors and across different countries. I think it's a continuous challenge, because it's always easy for every sector to build their own silo, but it's also there to show that there are additional benefits if you stick, say, to some standards and generic principles to avoid this pitfall as much as possible. And I think whatever you are going to build, I think showing interoperability should be also from governmental. If there is governmental support, say, in stimulating data spaces, that interoperability should be one of the key requirements. Show that you are interoperable across sectors or across countries, just to include it as a requirement for whatever money you are spending to stimulate this industry.
Thanks, Herman. I see the hand of Stefan. Hello.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Herman, for the very interesting presentation. I have a question which is a little bit more maybe into the details.
Yeah.
But you mentioned like interoperability is very important, obviously. Thanks a lot for that. Now, I mean, there are different levels of interoperability. Like the technical interoperability, I guess, is rather easy. The semantic interoperability is probably a lot more difficult. Now, if I understood you correctly, you have like defined common vocabularies to achieve this kind of. How easy was it to actually get an agreement on this, or how did you actually work to get an agreement? Because in my experience, that can take quite a lot of time to get agreement on these kinds of things.
Yeah, but we are also developing, say, now ecosystems that we can quicker align different vocabularies. I can't explain now the details, but also related to your questions, of course, say there is a technical, but I think what's even more important is also, say, the legal interoperability. Mm-hmm. So that's also a key concern. For instance, suppose we have a data space connected between Switzerland and the Netherlands, and companies are attached to that, and something goes wrong. So the data is becoming in the public. Who is liable? And in what regime, and where do we meet in court? Those kind of questions might be even more complex. And there is a very nice overview about, say, produced by the Dutch AI Coalition. It's about Federation of Data Spaces, which is covering, say, the different aspects. And already mentioning, say, if you drop me an email, or I can drop an email to Andre to share those different links, because it's, I think, about a 50-page document, explicitly say what's the current status and what are, say, also the challenges ahead in interoperability. Because in the end, I think the technology problems we can solve. It's more about standardization and also, say, accept that you maybe it's only the 80% best solution, but it's better to have an aligned solution than the 100% perfect solution. But I think those business models and legal are even of higher concern, because that's sometimes difficult to get alignment on that area.
Yeah. I will tell you about my email address or the email address of Swiss Data Alliance for requests for the slides and further documentations, of course. And I give for the last question this afternoon to Julia.
Hi, everybody. Herman, very, very interesting. Thank you. Really exciting what you guys are doing. There's sort of a more theoretical concept that I'm interested in this industrial data space that you have. It sounds to me that proof of concept, that the companies are sharing their data, that is, they're giving each other their data, right? They're not selling the data or getting something else in value in return. And one of the things that I wonder about is that we all know that data is very, very valuable. So the data that I generate in my company has not only value to me, but it has value to others.
Yeah.
And if we just talk about a mechanism for sharing data within silos, because it's useful for us, rather than to recognize that we really ought to build a platform where this valuable asset can be traded across silos and across entities. How do you guys think about that?
Now, one of the principles say what we try is that the data stays at the owner. So you get access to the data and not trying, say, so in that way, usage and access control is one of the main concerns also in this kind of area. So it's not sending the data to you, basically, but you get access to my data. And of course, say what we did also in Eindhoven, start with the simple areas, because it's a kind of evolution. What I also say, the kind of message, data space 1.0, you can bring it operational this year, also in Switzerland. And that's more about, say, information you already shared, like quotations, order, product information, maybe the delivery time in a more... that are, say, attributes to products which you anyhow have to deliver without, say, directly a price tag. Say the data space 2.0, 3.0 is about, for instance, real-time access, monitoring, maybe also design principles. And of course, there's also the discussion about the business model is heating up. But I would really recommend also bringing up the ego, start simple, relatively simple, let's put it that way, just to bring some efficiency. And it's also, say, when the internet started, I think this is kind of next way of, say, internet. It's comparable, like, say, in SCSM, in the past, you get an internet connections and you have the whole world and all service providers are available for you and can deliver services to you. This is, say, you get access to the data space and a whole realm of services are becoming available for you. Only it's now mostly, it starts with copying, say, what's in the old world, bringing it to the new world. And when you are attached to that, I definitely know that new service providers and business models will pop up, also exploiting, for instance, the value for your data. But I think at this stage, it's kind of early stage, it's really my belief that, say, secure access to a data space is the initial basic service you are delivering to all those kind of companies. And on top of, a whole realm of new service provider business will pop up with also different business models. Who's going to pay whom, for instance?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
As you see, I think there are a lot of questions around, and what is for sure that we will have follow-ups with you, Herman, because I think everybody in the call agrees that we can learn a lot from you and from your experiences.